So I have this little clip out of Jesus on the visor of my truck, if you can see this. And I think he's just supposed to represent like this little happy Jesus with his arms out, like, hey, let's bring it in for a hug, right? Uh, I have him on the visor of my truck, though, for a different reason, because there are times where I can become an embarrassing, angry version of myself that I don't like in the truck. And so in those moments, I will flip Jesus down, and it's as if he's saying, what are you doing? Right? I mean, is that going to help you? Right? And at least he's smiling about it, but it helps me kind of curb that a little bit. And I know that's none of you. You don't kind of deal with that. But when I'm in the safety of my car, I can find myself on the wrong days when I'm not at my best saying things and acting in ways that I would never have the guts to do to anybody's face. Right? And I will say these things to them as if they're actually listening to me back there, telling them how to get their sorry lives together and get out of the way. Right? And it happens so quickly. It's like I know they're doing it on purpose, too. It's like they're intentionally out to harm me because they know I need to get somewhere, and now they're just going to flex their power all over me, right? Now, in reality, they probably don't even know I'm behind them, which can kind of make me angry too when I think about it. But, what I fail to remember in those moments is that could be someone's pawpaw, right? That's somebody's mom with a baby in the back seat, or that's a 16-year-old that hasn't been driving very long, needs to be cautious, right? And so I start to realize this, and I need to come up with a better answer to why I do this, especially for like my wife when she's in the car and she gets to witness it and she teams up with Jesus. It's like, what are you doing? It's better than, I don't know, huff it off. So I psychoanalyzed myself. And let me share a little bit of what I learned might be going on there behind the scenes. Because what you might see is this real quick fit of rage. It might very well be driven by a lot of fears that are going on the inside. Because in that moment, when I'm in the car, my personal progress, it depends on the behaviors of all these other drivers, right? And if any of you have ever driven on Pea Ridge Road or you get stuck out here on the Lake Oconee Expressway, you kind of know what I'm talking about, right? You're at the mercy of their behaviors. And when they start driving slower than I want to go, then it disrupts my flow, right? It threatens my getting to where I need to go, right? I mean, their mercy, they're controlling me, and that's just not right. And so it feels like too many other areas in my life, maybe underneath all of that, areas that other areas I don't have control of. And so that starts to make me feel a bit insecure. I'm in my car. I got my plans. This is my autonomy. And in my car with my autonomy, I'm the king. Do they know who they're slowing down, right? This whole attitude starts to go. And when my plans start to get breached, then that threatens my sense of security, my sense of order. It starts to trigger this rage as a defense mechanism. Plus, I've recognized that I'm at the stage of life now, the older I get, it's like every little minute starts to feel more and more precious. It's a commodity to me now. And so I don't have these moments to be losing behind Miss Daisy. I need her to get going, right? And so when he starts to disrupt my schedule, it starts to feel like I'm losing control of my day, which means I'm starting to lose control of my autonomy, which means I'm starting to lose control of my life. So you just need to move, right? Let's go. It's the pedal on the right. Go. But what I realize, and somebody might be thinking, all right, Dennis, thanks for that exhaustive explanation, Dr. Freud. You could actually just leave a little bit earlier, right, and probably save your life trouble. And I know that you're absolutely right. I'm working on this. It's amazing how much less frustrated I feel when I'm not late. It's also amazing to kind of just sit back and actually start to understand some of these thoughts and feelings and emotions that are behind the behaviors we see on the outside. Because, on the inside of each of us, there are these forces. Forces that influence how we react to our kids, how we react to our spouse, how we react to the boss or to the neighbors. And so over the next few weeks, we're going to kind of just open up the hood and we're going to explore some of this in this series. Things inside us that drive us. And so today we're going to lean in and kick off talking about some of that fear that resides inside of us. And it's something we've all experienced, especially in the last couple of weeks, right? On some level. But fear is one of these things, too, that can be really, really hard to admit. It's just a whole lot easier to just let yourself get angry. And I think that's somewhat kind of a learned cultural thing, maybe even to us. It's socially acceptable for us to deal with our junk by either getting angry or being silly. We just kind of silly it away. But if we start admitting to things like, oh, I'm sad, or that hurt my feelings, or I'm lonely, I mean, what have we been taught? For the most part, it's, suck it up. Get over it, right? Move on, grow up. And so we might not say I'm angry or admit to being angry. It's hard. But anger is really just a sense of passion on the inside of us. Instead of saying that we're afraid, it's a lot easier to mask it with that anger. But fear needs answers. All of these emotions. Fear itself is neither good nor bad. All of these emotions, they just kind of are. They're in us. Now, fear doesn't feel good, but it can be a really good teacher, right? It can be really helpful. Fear can protect us from a lot of things. And I believe God made us all to fear. He put that in us, but God does not intend for us to live in fear. And I think that's universal for all of us. You might not even really be sure about the whole God thing or the church thing yet. But I think that all of us can understand that fear is something, you might not even be sure about where you sit with God. But being able for all of us, church people or not, how we manage the fear, what we do with the fear, that kind of helps determine whether we feel it's good or bad, what we do with them. And so I like to kind of think of emotions like data. They're like these pieces of information that can point us in a direction. So when I'm feeling sad, I need comfort, right? When I'm feeling lonely, I need connection. When I'm feeling hurt, well, hurts need attention. Hurts need care, right? And when I'm feeling angry, anger is a voice that wants to be heard. I need to be heard and understood. And when I'm afraid, fear wants knowledge. Fear wants answers. And we all have the capacity to feel fear. But none of us have to live in that fear. There's a difference. We all have the capacity to feel fear. None of us thrive, though, when we live in fear. And so we're going to talk about this difference over the next couple of minutes. Fear doesn't always feel good, and there's not always really even good answers to give our fear. The knowledge isn't always there, and so that's when it turns to anxiety. That's when we start to get keyed up. That's when things start to feel out of control. And so although fear can point us in the right direction, sometimes we can learn from it. All those unchecked fears, all that unresolved anxiety, that can start to steer us in the wrong direction. And fear can become a really great manipulator, right? Fear can be used to get people to do what you want them to do. Fear is a great marketer, because it tends to feed on all those unanswered questions we have, all those anxieties, all those unknowns, all the worst case scenarios. We buy in because we're afraid. And especially when you start to use it with things like religion and politics, it can seem like this is something that's becoming increasingly worse. But it's really not anything that's all that new. Different situations, but you can go all the way back to the times of Jesus in the New Testament. You imagine shortly after the time of Jesus' ministry, there's this roller coaster of emotions and thoughts and ideas, all about how these new followers of Jesus, as they began to organize themselves around this new movement that Jesus had just started. There were exciting moments at sometimes. There was a lot of momentum. And then at other times, there was just confusion and chaos, right? There was even some infighting in some of the churches. People both inside the church and outside the church would come in and try to use some of this fear and uncertainty to their own profit, to their own purposes. And so Paul wrote a lot of letters to these churches that he had helped plant around the Mediterranean. And in a lot of these letters, he sought to correct some of this confusion, to encourage them to remember who their real strength and who their real faith should be in. Encourage those that are feeling threatened and for those that are feeling afraid. Point them back to that security, to that faith, to that strength that's found in following Jesus, that confidence, who came to be their ultimate Savior, their ultimate leader, their ultimate king, regardless of who was leading the empire, leading the local provinces they lived in. And so 2 of these letters Paul wrote were to a young protege. His name was Timothy. And the first letter that Paul wrote to Timothy, he actually wrote while he was in prison. So kind of keep that in context as he talks about fear. But he wrote these letters sometime around 60 to 65, so it wasn't really all that long after Jesus had ended his earthly ministry. And Timothy was serving at the time as this young pastor in the city of Ephesus. And Ephesus was known as a city of a lot of diversity, a lot of divisive ideas and beliefs. It was kind of this melting pot of a lot of different religions and a lot of different political affiliations. It's interesting because Ephesus was the home to the Temple of Artemis. And the Temple of Artemis was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And so because of the strategic location, because of the marketplaces, the city had a lot of influence on things like politics and the economy. And there were frequently public gatherings and even demonstrations that were held that could quickly turn into riots. In fact, you can read about one of them in the book of Acts in our New Testament about this one silversmith. His name was Demetrius. And he incited a mob in the center of Ephesus, all because of stoking fears of how this new Jesus movement is going to impact their business and their religion. Because the social fabric of Ephesus, it was really all tightly wound around their religious practices and their trade. And so converts to Christianity at this time, they could face a lot of opposition, face a lot of isolation, ostracism. They could face some really serious economic or business losses, which could also mean they'd lose a sense of security, a sense of community support. And so inside this young church at Ephesus, they faced even more opposition with false teachers that would come in, people trying to manipulate on these fears, drive the church in a different direction, internal conflicts, which created an even more tense, uncertain environment for Timothy to try to lead through. So there was a lot to be anxious about. There was a lot to be fearful about. And so Paul writes these 2 letters to Timothy. And the first letter is really all about trying to build up Timothy's faith, build up his leadership, encourage him in that, because I'm sure he's feeling strained with it, right? Taught him how to organize this new church, what the good leaders look like, what the good leaders do, what don't they do. This was the letter in which he instructed Timothy to tell all the people who are rich in this world to also be rich toward the things of God. And so a little later on, he writes the second letter to Timothy, but he starts this letter out seeming a little more fatherly, like he calls Timothy his dear son. And then he writes this, first part of 2 Timothy. Timothy, I thank God for you, the God I serve with a clear conscience. And what he means by that, he's not talking about feeling guilty or anything like that. It's more about this feeling confident, like I'm unashamed, I'm unafraid. A clear conscience, just as my ancestors did. Night and day, I constantly remember you in my prayers. I long to see you again, for I remember. I can remember when we parted. I remember your tears. And I will be filled with joy again when we see each other, when we're together again. He goes on, he says, I remember your genuine faith. It's genuine because it's been tested. He says, for you share the faith that first filled your grandmother Lois, your mother Eunice, and I know that same faith continues strong in you. And so he said, this is why I remind you to fan into flames these spiritual gifts that God gave you when I laid my hands on you. I always thought that was a little bit funny. He's not talking about like, hey, I'm going to throw hands with you or anything. This was when Timothy got set apart as a minister, and Paul prayed over him. Kind of think about it like a coach maybe puts his hand on a player's shoulders that's maybe struggling or a little bit afraid. Hey, man, you got this. You can do this, right? So then he goes on and he says this, right? For God has not given us a spirit of fear. Think about this, Timothy. All this stuff that you're facing, all this anxiety, all this pressure that you're under. God has not given us a spirit of fear and timidity, but of power, love, and self-discipline. Right, Timothy, I know you're feeling the pressure right now. I know that there's a lot of fear and uncertainty around you, inside of you. But there is a better strategy than just hunkering down and living in that fear. Now, again, Paul believed, as well as many of us believe, that God created us with all of these emotions, including fear. But, but God does not intend for us to live in that spirit of fear. We might manage the fear, but we don't have to let fear manage us. So what's the difference in that? How does that look? How can I embrace some of that? Well, fear is really just kind of a normal part of being alive, isn't it? I mean, it just is. It's not good or bad. It's just something that happens. Fear, it isn't even a spiritual thing. It's just a human thing. And it kicks in when we sense some kind of danger, right? You see a snake or somebody runs a red light in front of you. It's a way of keeping us safe. It protects us. And this kind of fear is usually temporary. It's usually kind of specific to a certain situation. And so your heart might start to race. You might breathe a little heavier, right? You might even get a little bit sweaty when you're afraid. But it helps you react quickly. It's that fight or flight or that freeze that kicks in, avoiding that danger, right? So when that bear jumps out from behind that bush at you, I don't have to think about it. I just punch him in the nose, right? That's what fear can do. But on the other hand, the spirit of fear that Paul is talking about here, this is more of a constant state of living with the uncertainty, of the anxiety, even when there might not be a direct threat to you right now, just feeling unsure. And this is something we all feel. I mean, whether you consider yourself to be a spiritual person or not, we all kind of understand what that heaviness can feel like. It's kind of like carrying this cloud of fear over top of us that just won't go away, even though there isn't really anything right in front of us to make us afraid. And that cloud can stop you from doing things that would be helpful for you, stop you doing things you want to do or you need to do. It can make you feel stuck. It can make you feel powerless. And so then you start to you continually feel anxious at all the future uncertainties that are out there, all the questions that you don't have answers to, which means you start to avoid opportunities that might be good to you. It might keep you from taking some risks that might be valuable. You lack the confidence to speak up for yourself, to assert yourself. And so we also kind of want to pull others in when we're going through this because we don't want to feel it alone. And all of us know kind of what this fear can do to us. But Paul, again, he writes and says, God does not intend for you. You do not have to live in this spirit of fear, this constant worry. And if you're feeling that, heaviness, that's not from God. Instead, God has offered us something much, much better. Power, love, self-discipline. And so these are the gifts that can help us face fear head on. We start to live with confidence. We start to live with purpose. So look again. Paul says God has not given us a spirit of fear and timidity, but of power. And now we all live in just a rapidly, increasingly changing world, and that can make us feel powerless a lot of the times. Things are just out of our control. But the power that Paul is talking about here, it's not so much about controlling others or controlling anything else. What he's really talking about here is the ability to find an inner strength and the ability to persevere. It's not just kind of white-knuckling my way through something, but it's the ability to be able to step back and trust myself to something greater than just me. Now, when we think about power, I mean, it's kind of easy to think about someone who's in authority, right? Someone who makes decisions, someone who influences outcomes. And when we start to think about power just in those ways, it starts to become this thing about controlling people or controlling situations. We might even try to force things and start to think, well, if I can just be loud enough, right? If I can just be persuasive enough, if I can think hard enough, if I can yell hard enough, argue strong enough, then I can make things change. I can turn it out right. But that kind of power pursuit, if you've ever done that, you know it's exhausting. It's something you have to keep on and keep on and keep on with. And it's frustrating because eventually you're going to run into the truth that you can't control everybody and you can't control every situation. And when we bump into that truth, that starts to lead to some even deeper set fears and things that we don't want to admit about ourselves, such as fear of failure. A lot of high achievers deal with this. We all feel it at some points, but those of you that are like go-getters, I mean, this can even disguise itself as a fear of success because, yeah, I mean, things are successful right now, but how long can I keep this up? What if they find out? What if I'm just not good enough? How long is it going to take for them to realize that I can't keep this going? It can feel paralyzing, right? What about a fear of rejection? It's probably one of the most common fears that we all feel, but probably one of the least common to talk about. But what do people think about me? What would people think about me if they knew my flaws? What will people think about me if they figure out I'm not perfect? Fear of change, right? We know what this feels like. We've experienced this. But it's not just around elections and changes like that. I mean, we fear changes in a move. We fear changes on the job. We fear changes in leadership and family structures and changes with the kids. And so we can't help but ask ourselves sometimes, okay, what if though? What if? What if? I think this is good, but what if it isn't? I think this is the right move, but what if it doesn't pan out? What if things don't get better? What if they actually get worse? And then there's just the overwhelming fear of the unknown. And I think this kind of feeds all the other fears because fear wants answers. And sometimes there just aren't answers. So we can't help but ask, okay, well, what's going to happen then? It's like this need to know, and I can never really know. So we start this cycle of anxiety, and we ruminate, and we twist ourselves up, and just needing to have answers that we can't get, and it keeps us from making decisions. It keeps us from taking risks. And it's easy to start thinking the answer is to just push our way through, just to power up, just more grit. And listen, I'm all for grit. I believe in facing our fears in a healthy way. But the power that Paul was talking about is a different kind of grit. It's this inner strength that comes from trusting God, from trusting in a power that's bigger than just my own. This power doesn't rely on everything, trying to get everything just right in order to relieve the stress and disappointment. It's like when we lean into that, it's like trying to steer a ship through a storm just on sheer force, right? The winds and the waves are beating against it, and we're just going to force our way through it. But trusting God's power, it's more like setting an anchor in that storm. Like, I still acknowledge the storm. The fear is still there. But I'm anchored to something stronger than just myself. I'm not alone in it. Now listen, I know firsthand how hard it is to trust ourselves to something or something else beyond ourselves. I think that's why we like to think about power more in terms of control. But this inner strength, this is about facing challenges without feeling overwhelmed, because I don't have to do it on my own. There's someone there alongside of me. There's something undergirding me. I don't feel overwhelmed. It's about learning how to adapt and to act confidently. It's empowered by something greater than just me. And when we can embrace this kind of power, we start to shift our thinking away from always having to be in control to more about trusting and resilience, bouncing back. So God's not giving us a spirit of fear and timidity, but it goes on, but of power and of love. Because it's easy. We know how easy it is to let our disagreements start to drive a wedge between us and to separate us. And it doesn't even have to be big disagreements. We start to fear. We start to distrust each other. But this love that Paul is talking about here, this goes beyond just trying to agree on everything. And he's also not talking about just rolling over on everything either. This is about seeing the image of God in each other, recognizing that God loves everyone who will ever cross my path, everyone. Even when, or more like especially when, they see things differently than me, or they hold different values or different views than me. But now here's the rub. We all know this. There's always going to be disagreements. The goal should never be to avoid disagreement. But it also seems like Christian folk have built a reputation for being really good at disagreeing with each other, which is why I think we have a lot of work to do in this area. And you might not even be a Christian. You might agree with that, but I don't think you have to even be a Christian to understand this is a universal challenge for all of us. And one of the big reasons I think that we all still have some work to do in this area is represented in something called the Miles Law. And this was named after a guy named Rufus Miles. He served in the administrations of Eisenhower and Johnson and Kennedy. And you may have heard this before. Miles Rufus once said this. He said, "Where you stand depends on where you sit." What you stand for, what you believe in, your values, all that, that all depends on where you sit. And what he meant by that was that your personal cultural context, right, where you live, who you're related to, how much money you have, all those things where you sit determine your perspective on life. And so they determine what you see, and they determine how you see them and how you interpret them and how you experience the different things in life. Like, for silly example, I'm a Georgia Bulldog fan. I'm an anxious, fearful Georgia Bulldogs fan today, but I'm diehard. And I lived like better than 20 years of my life in the Midwest in Missouri. And for all of those 20 years that I lived in Missouri, I was still a Georgia Bulldog fan. It was really fun to be a Georgia Bulldog fan in Missouri. But I'm a Georgia Bulldog fan because I was born over here in Thomaston, Georgia. I spent a lot of my growing up years riding down dirt roads in South Georgia with my grandpa, right? That Georgia red clay is literally in my blood. I like peaches and blueberries a lot more than I like things like pears and cherries. I call it pecans. I call them pecans, not pecans. And I love Waffle House. And you can disagree with me on any or all of that, right? You have the right to be wrong. But honestly, listen, that might be a pretty good strategy and approach for some people in your life. Maybe it's just not worth all of that, right? I can disagree with you. You might have the right to be wrong on some stuff. I'm going to let you have that one, but I'm going to love you anyway. I'm going to love you anyway. I remember we almost moved to New Hampshire several years back. I was looking at a job up there. And on one of our visits, we went to a local diner for breakfast. And I saw on the menu they had sausage, gravy, and biscuits. So I was like, yeah, okay, that appeals. I like that. So I asked the waitress bring that. And she'd been listening. She's like, you're from the South, right? And I said, yeah, that's where I grew up. She said, you're not going to want these. You're not going to like these. You don't want these. I'm like, no, I'm trying to embrace culture, trying to embrace the local feel here. So, yeah, let me try your sausage, gravy, and biscuits. So, all right, so she brings them out in a bowl. That was the first kind of like, what? I cannot begin to explain how offensive these were to me. They were like some kind of, I don't know, white cornbread cookie with sausage soup on the top of it. And I tried them, and it was not, no, I mean, it was gross. It was nasty to me. I did not like this at all. I was thinking, these people are nuts. These are crazy. How does anybody eat this? Come to find out, it was one of the most popular things on their menu there locally. So a lot of New Englanders seem to love this. But for me, it's like, no way. There's no way I'm going to eat this. I asked her, how are the eggs around here? And she's like, you're safe, right? So, but I know our differences can go a whole lot deeper than biscuits. But there's a principle here. And we're always going to disagree on things like politics. We're going to disagree on things like religion. But we can also differ on things like health and education. Man, there are so many choices for parents out there about how to raise your kids now, right? A lot of different philosophies about how to run your business. A lot of different interests you might have, different hobbies than other people. And all that's fine. All that can work great as long as we stay mature enough not to let that become a divisive thing between us. But mostly, all of those views, all of those values, all those likes, they came from things we really didn't have a lot of control over. Where I was born, where we lived, where and how I was educated. Things I've been told, the things I've seen, the things I've experienced, what my parents believed. And if we just step back for a moment to acknowledge that about each other, to take a deep breath when those people that have sat differently than I have, then I don't have to change my opinions. I don't have to change my beliefs, but I can gain a greater understanding as to why they might think the way they think, why they might believe the things they do. And then we won't fear them as much because now I understand you. We won't feel the need to become divisive because I don't have to protect myself from you. We can just disagree. We can experience empathy. We can experience appreciation for each other. And those things are necessary if we're going to embrace the kind of love, the spirit of love that Paul is talking about. I mean, this goes back to Jesus' greatest commandment, right? This goes back to the cross. This goes back to the epicenter of everything that we as Christians hold true to our faith. Love one another. And I love the reminder that the Apostle John gave us. John was he was the guy that called himself the disciple that Jesus loved. So you know they were tight, they were close. Like John did life with Jesus up close and personal. And later into his older years, looking back kind of reflectively, this is what he wrote. He said, in this world, we are like Jesus. There's no fear in love. But perfect love drives out fear. And he could write that because he'd experienced that. So embracing the spirit of love, it means to learn to love fearlessly. It means to learn to love anyway. It means to learn to love like Jesus. So here's Paul's third strategy in this, right? We're not given a spirit of fear, timidity, but a power, love, and self-discipline. And that can be maybe the most difficult because it's just hard for some of us to say. Because we tend to think, I think we all tend to think we're all somewhat self-disciplined on some level about ourselves. But for me, it's embarrassing how quickly things can come unglued and I can become all unraveled and anxious when someone challenges me or someone disagrees with me. And I think this has especially got to be true for those of you who are parents or even grandparents, because there's so many differing ideas out there about how to raise your kids and how to do your family. A lot of those fears that come from that can raise up. But not only do you have to worry about like keeping your kids safe, making sure they don't get hurt, making sure they stay healthy. But for every other struggle you can have as a parent or as a husband, as a wife, right? There are multitudes of books and answers out there for how to fix yourself, how to make this thing perfect. And when you look at all of that and you realize I'm not doing any of that, it can start to imply, well, maybe I'm just not good at this. Maybe I'm not a good parent. Do I do enough for them, right? Do I do enough to expose them to good things? Am I exposing them to the wrong things? What if I'm limiting their potential? Are my kids falling behind? I don't know. Depending on what so-and-so said, maybe, right? What if I make a mistake? What if I let them down? So much out there to be anxious about. And I think this can bleed over into a lot of our different relationships, because the less we start to feel like we measure up, the more those fears and anxieties start to rise to the surface, and then we can become a lot more reactive. We lose focus on our long-term goals because we're only worried about right now. We even might become defensive about it. But here's some good news, all right? God has created all of us to be biodynamic, which is a real fancy way of saying that with all that stress and all the anxiety you might be feeling, all of us have a pretty good ability of bouncing back with some pretty good strategies. You can quickly rebound with a good attitude, with some intentionality about it. In fact, there was a psychologist, his name was Peter Coleman, and I listened to him do a recent interview, and he said some things that I thought was really fascinating. He heads up something called the Difficult Conversations Lab. Listen to one thing he said in this interview. He said there's some neuroscience research that when you see a post that says something you think is insane, and you experience a sense of outrage and a taste for retaliation, get this, it triggers the same parts of the brain that are triggered by narcotics. What? Yeah. I mean, it's the same kind of activity. They've looked at this in your brain. Your brain gets lit up in that same area. Now, in other words, what he's saying here, there's a lot of fear, there's a lot of outrage, there's a lot of things to divide ourselves over out there, and just about anything you can imagine, we can find some way of disagreeing about it. And we have somehow become somewhat addicted to it. We look for it. We feed on it, right? We habituate ourselves to these feelings so that we might actually go out looking for content to engage with like that. It fuels those emotions. But listen to me, our brains are malleable. What's learned can be unlearned if we're intentional about it. Let me offer you a few little suggestions to maybe help you with some of your self-discipline in these areas. First, just learn to pause and reflect. Just take a breather. Sometimes just really good deep breath can help reset everything before I say anything, right? Before reacting impulsively. That self-discipline can encourage us to just be calm, to think before we speak, to choose our words before they come flying out of our mouths or across the keyboard. And that reduces the likelihood of escalating a lot of these conflicts. Practice respect and empathy. It's not something that necessarily comes natural to us. It's something we learn because it's easy to just be dismissive to people that don't think like us, that have different ideas than us. We react harshly when our views are challenged. So self-discipline can teach us to respect other people's opinions. And it is a discipline. We can even disagree with them and still respect them. Seek to understand where other people are coming from first before we engage in a conversation with them. That helps bridge some of those gaps. And look for common ground. Listen, for every one thing that you can find to disagree with somebody about, there are a multitude of things that you can find to connect with them on, I promise. And so self-discipline would be intentionally looking for the things where we can agree, not necessarily always focusing on the places where we disagree. That helps us steer towards solutions instead of just dwelling on all the problems that we have. Then set some boundaries. Set some boundaries for yourself, right? This constant exposure to the news and to social media. And I like them both. But when you're overwhelmed with all of that, it can really start to make you feel anxious and like really things are out of control. Self-discipline would be able to set some boundaries on that, to be able to differentiate, to stay away from just the echo chambers. I challenge you to take a 3-day break from social media every once in a while. Just kind of purge the system. And then engage positively. Self-discipline doesn't mean that I just kind of pull back and never say anything. I engage, but there's a way to do this in a way that moves things forward. Try to approach things, difficult conversations with a mindset to learn something. Be curious, right? Try to understand versus always trying to win the argument. This is something I talk about often with couples who I meet with. And so one of the things that I'll ask them is, do you want to be right or do you want the relationship? Because in your arguing, let's assume you are 110% right and you can prove it. Here's the evidence. You're wrong and I'm right. What do you win? Not on the couch, right? Cold winds through the house. Is that really what you want? No. So learn to engage positively. And the last thing I would suggest is just sweat a little bit. Now, I'm not talking about sweat because you're anxious and fearful, but just get up and get the circulation going a little bit. Just as little as 5 or 10 minutes of really light exercise. Take a walk, do some stretching, do some deep breathing. Even you can sit and do that. All of that has a way of helping the brain, the mind reset, to calm itself down, to think more clearly, and it reduces anxiety. It's just science. Well, let me offer you one final thought, and then I'm going to kind of tie a bow on this for this morning. But I used to, in a former career job life, I was in sales training, and one of the most valuable things I learned out of that was a technique. It was applied to that time where it's time to close the deal, right? It's time to ask for the business. And so you've stated your case. You've done a really good job. You've presented all the reasons they should buy in. You're really confident in your product. You've been really attuned to their needs. You've respected all that. You have genuine concern for their best interests. And so now it's time, right? You slide over the paper. You hand them the pen. And you shut up. And I was told next one talks loses. And eventually, if and when they said something, any kind of rebuttal, anything except then okay, anything other than an agreement, followed up with one of the most powerful phrases I've ever heard. I can appreciate that. So simple. But man, I don't know, billions of times I've used this in my life. I can appreciate that. I hear you. I'm listening. I can even understand where you're coming from. I get it. I don't necessarily agree. In my brain, I might be thinking you're crazy. Were you even listening to me? But no, I can appreciate that. And I can hope now to continue the conversation a little bit more. No pressure, no manipulation, no fear tactics. I closed a lot more deals by being a nice guy versus being an aggressive guy. And I know there's some of you in this room that do a lot of sales, and you might disagree with that philosophy. And I can appreciate that. But I think God created all of us with this capacity to fear, right? Fear is not wrong. Fear just is. We all have the capacity to feel fear, but God does not intend for any of us to live in that state of fear. We don't have to. Fear might visit us, but fear does not have to take up residence in our heart and our minds. Fear can feel paralyzing at times, but faith, trust can mobilize us. Fear can isolate. It can divide, but love drives out fear. And so I hope as you encounter whatever level of fear and anxiety you might run into this week, and I'm sure you will, that you can embrace these gifts of an inner strength beyond yourself, of the intestinal fortitude to respond in love rather than reacting in fear. Let me pray for us. Father, I thank you for a strength that goes beyond our own. And I thank you that you empower us to do what we can. But in those moments where we feel helpless, where we feel powerless, where things really aren't happening the way that we want them to or intend to, and we're maybe afraid of where they're going, that we can rest in those moments, at least knowing we're not in it alone, that you are not unaware, that we can lower our anchor of trust. Even though it's hard, it means letting go of control. But God, help us to really take a hard look at the alternatives and what that's getting us. And to know that there's a gift there of trusting in you. Regardless of who's running the empire, regardless of who's running the country, who's running the state, who's running the business. You're ultimately the king. You're ultimately our leader. And we trust you. Sometimes maybe because that's all we know to do, but we trust you. Give us the courage to do that. We pray this in Jesus' name.